Well, shifting to the successor states, the first one I want to talk about is Byzantium, because Byzantium is one of the more surprising civilizations that we cover in this course. It's largely unknown to Europeans or Americans for that matter, but in actual fact, a highly complex civilization existed based on Constantinople from roughly 330 until 1453. We're dealing with, what's that, 1100 some years that the Byzantine Empire existed, making it one of the longer lasting ones in history, and as a result it was very important, particularly for Eastern Europe. If you want to understand why there was an Eastern Europe, why there was an Iron Curtain, why Eastern Europe was different than Western Europe, it's largely because affairs, political, religious, cultural affairs in the East were dominated by Byzantium for so long. One of the interesting things about the Byzantine Empire, after Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire there in 330, partly because of defensive reasons, he couldn't maintain the defensive system in the West, the people of the East continually thought of themselves as Romans. Even after Rome collapsed, Rome fell away and everything, the people living in Byzantium, in the Eastern Mediterranean, part of that Byzantine Empire, considered themselves Romans. They called themselves Romans, even though they spoke Greek, they studied Greek classics and everything. They considered themselves the Roman heirs. One of the most important things that they inherited from Rome and that they passed on to Eastern Europe was the power and dominance of the emperor. Constantine, when he moved the capital east, made his office, the office of emperor, anointed of the Lord. In other words, since there was one God, there was one emperor chosen by God. He made his office a divine office, and that increased his power on earth. He also, when he moved the capital eastwards, abandoned the Senate, abandoned all pretensions of Republican Rome, and that even further consolidated his power. So in the East, in Byzantium, the emperor was far more powerful than he had ever been in Rome, and he added yet another office. He added the office of head of the church. And this is something, the technical term, we call it Caesaropapism, Caesar Pope, one man who is both Caesar, head of the state, one man who is Pope, head of the church. And what happened here was, when the emperor left Rome, the Pope was left behind there. And in the West, the Pope really was the only authority there. The emperor was in the East, he wasn't there. And the Pope was sitting in Rome, the Pope was running things. He was the power. In the East, it was different. The emperor was there. And even though there was a representative of the Pope there, a church office there, the Pope was 1,000 miles away. And it was the emperor who decided church matters. It was the emperor who paid bishops. It was the emperor who called church councils. It was the emperor who decided issues of church doctrine. It was the emperor who sent out church missionaries. And this even further added to his power, because he was also head of the church in addition to being head of a powerful state. So when Constantinople, emissaries from Constantinople went to Eastern Europe, went to the Bulgars, went to where present-day Romania is in Yugoslavia, went to where the Russians were, all these Eastern peoples borrowed their political ideas from Byzantium. And as a result, each of these states emerged, eventually politically, with very powerful rulers. Rulers who also ruled a national church. They were also head of the church. So this Caesaropapism idea from Byzantium was very crucial in determining the later political fate of Eastern Europe, because they all borrowed on this pattern. They didn't follow a Western example. They borrowed from Byzantium. The other uniqueness about Byzantium was that it was what we would call a state-regulated economy. The emperor and the state controlled the economy to a vast degree. For example, wages and prices were all fixed by imperial decree. So what this craftsman got or this craftsman got were all fixed by decree of the state. In addition, the state held certain important monopolies over production of, for example, silk, which it had smuggled out of China, silk, purple dye, gold embroidery. A number of these important industries, very lucrative industries, were all controlled by the state, owned by the state itself. In addition, the state owned land, it owned farms, cattle, agricultural implements, everything. Not entirely, but vast pieces of that. And workers were fixed in their status. If you were a peasant, you were going to remain a peasant. If you're a craftsman, you were going to remain a craftsman. All this was controlled, regulated, administered by the state, and it was very productive. The Byzantine economy flourished really until the 1200s, and the only reason it stopped flourishing was the fact that Constantinople was sacked by crusaders. So this government regulation of the economy was very important, it was very lucrative, and this was something also that Eastern Europe borrowed from Byzantium. When you look at Russia, early Russian serfdom, the economy of early Russia, it was borrowed right from Byzantium, these large estates managed by the government, for the most part with peasants bounded to the land, bounded to the estates. And this is one of the reasons why serfdom arose very early on in Eastern Europe. But above all, beyond the emperor, beyond the economy, what dominated the East was religion. And religion was very important in the East. You read in the textbook all these little comments that there were, if you walked into a butcher's shop, what you talk about is issues of religion. If you walked into a coffee shop, what you talked about was issues of religion. It was religion that really dominated the intellectual and cultural processes in the East. And one of the reasons probably was that state and church were so closely tied together. And the church itself provided kind of a unifying bond in the East between all the disparate peoples that made up the emperor. And it also probably extends back to the fact that the East had a longer intellectual and cultural heritage than the West. And they were more interested in intellectual affairs dating back to the Greeks. So for that matter, the church was very important. The theological underpinnings and arguments that went along with the church were often discussed. And it was the church that got the East into trouble, or got the church into trouble. And it was over a variety of issues that eventually Eastern and Western churches split. And the important thing to remember is that technically there was one Christian church until 1054. Even though that there were differences developing in the East, there was not a formal split of churches until 1054. And one of these issues that developed very early on was over the use of icons. And icons are holy images, sculptures, paintings, frescoes, images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, the Holy Family, the apostles, saints, whatever. And these icons were widely used in the churches. They were often considered to have powers of healing and protection. In other words, an image of St. Augustine, for example, would have some sort of, if you pray to it, it would grant you some sort of protection from some evil demon or whatever. And everywhere, both in East and West, icons were very, very popular because they appealed to the people. It was something that people could easily understand that they were praying to this or that saint. Now, the problem was, in a lot of cases, people were praying to the picture itself, and they attributed the picture or this piece of rock or this relic or whatever the powers of healing and protection, and not the saint somewhere. In other words, they were almost worshiping idols. And this came to the attention of a Byzantine emperor by the name of Leo. And in 725, the Byzantine emperor himself forbade the use of icons. He said this was paganistic. this was a violation of one of the original 10 Commandments, and that this had to go. This was no, you people, you have to stop praying to these pictures. You have to stop worshiping these rocks. It's out. It's taboo. And Leo sent the army out, and the army was there to destroy statues, whitewash over frescoes, to destroy all these icons. And this policy of what is called iconoclasm, the breaking of icons, the destruction of icons, was then followed up by his son, Constantine V. Well, the Pope didn't look on this very lightly. He didn't like it at all. He objected to this whole practice. He wanted to continue the use of icons. And as a result, the Pope excommunicated the emperor. He said, no, you can't do this. I make the decisions. You don't make the decision. We're keeping the icons. They're useful. People like them. The church likes them. The icons stay. You go. Well, eventually they compromised. In the 9th century, they changed the wording around a little bit, and they restored icons, and they agreed to the compromise that icons could require reverence but not adoration. You could revere an icon, but you couldn't adore it. You couldn't worship it. The prayers were to the icon that it symbolized, the priest or the saint or whatever, but not the actual object. And in return, the excommunications were lifted, and the East went back with the Western Church very nicely. But this was the first issue that arose between East and West. It was followed by a number of other issues. Church practices in the East began to diverge from the West. For example, in the East, priests could marry, priests wore beards, priests used leavened bread in the ceremonies instead of unleavened bread. A lot of these little practice issues began to arise. In addition to the practice issues, there was a major issue of control of the church. The Pope deeply resented the fact that the Eastern Emperor controlled the church in the East. The Pope wanted to control the church because, when you controlled the church, you controlled the wealth of the church. Bottom line, wealth, money. And the Pope didn't like the fact that all that money was escaping his realm, or that a secular figure was running the church in half of the empire. Very early on, there were differences over this. The Pope's appeal to the emperor to stop appointing bishops, to listen to the Pope. And eventually, it got so bad that in 751, the Pope turned to the Franks. And we're going to be talking about the Franks in a little bit. The Franks were the early Frenchmen. And the Pope turned to the Franks for military protection. He said, I can't trust you Byzantines anymore. I can't trust you guys. You guys aren't helping me out with your army. I need military support. You're not helping me. I'm going to the Franks. And that was followed up in the year 800 when the Pope went to the Franks and crowned Charlemagne Holy Roman Emperor. And this, of all things, the emperor sitting in Byzantium says, wait, I'm the Roman Emperor. What are you guys doing? How can you crown somebody else the Roman Emperor? I'm the emperor. Not taken too kindly by Byzantium, this when the popes turned to the West for military and political support. That added to the tension, and the tension was further added to in the late 9th century when there occurred a race to convert the Bulgars, or the present-day Bulgarians. And the Bulgars were pagan. Han Boris, or King Boris at that time, decided that he would play off Byzantium and Rome against each other to see the better deal, what kind of deal he could get from each side. And emissaries from Byzantium came to the Bulgars, and emissaries from the Pope in Rome came to the Bulgars, and they talked about what would happen if they Christianized them. And Boris said, well, yes, okay, I accept you, Rome. I'll become Christianized under your auspices. And he changed his mind and said, well, okay, Byzantium, I'll become Christian under your auspices. And then he changed his mind. back and forth. This saga went on until eventually Boris opted for Byzantium. And he opted for the emissaries from Byzantium, Christianizing himself from Byzantium, because Byzantium promised him an autonomous church. The Pope said, if you become Christian, you're part of the entire church. There's no such thing as separate churches. You're all part of one Catholic universal church. Byzantium said differently. They said, if you accept Christianity, you have your own Bulgarian church. It's a Christian church, but it's Bulgarian church. It's run by Bulgarian officials. This was a landmark decision because all of Eastern Europe, Romania, Serbia, Russia, all accepted Christianity from Byzantium, all established national churches. In the West, there was no such thing as national churches. As a result, in the West, Latin, the church, formed a cultural medium through which developments were spread throughout the West. And as a result, the Great Awakening of the 12th century, the later Renaissance, the universities, scholasticism, all took place within the universal West because it was spread through the church for a large part. In the East, that didn't happen because every country had its own church. There was no unifying bond between all these churches. So Russia developed this way, Bulgaria developed this way, Serbia developed this way. There was no way for cultural achievements in Russia to spread to Serbia or vice versa. And this was a result out of this decision by Khan Boris or the Bulgars to accept Christianity from Byzantium. That decision, of course, irritated the Pope to no end, the fact that he had lost this race with Byzantium. And it was yet another issue contributing to the growing divergence between East and West. Yet one other issue here that contributed to that was a real cultural difference between East and West. The East spoke Greek. They looked back on their Greek forefathers with great reverence and acclaim. And the East considered the West really barbarian. They had no culture. They couldn't speak Greek. They knew nothing of the classical authors. You guys are barbarians. You can't even talk to us on our level. The barbarian West, on the other hand, thought the Greek people feminine type characters. You guys run around in your little toga, you speak Greek and everything. But put a sword in your hand and see what the bottom line is and everything. And there's really this growing cultural clash between East and West that had been going on throughout after the fall of Rome and the growth of Byzantium. But the real final issue that brought about the church split was over the creed, the Apostles' Creed, or the creed of the church, the statement of church beliefs. At the Council of Nicaea in 325, a council called by Constantine, the church had adopted a creed, and in that creed they had made this statement on the Trinity, the idea of the Trinity, the three parts of God at the same time. And they wrote up this little creed, this statement of beliefs, and in that creed they said that the Spirit proceeds from the Father. The Spirit proceeds from the Father. Well, when the Pope translated this Greek creed into Latin, they added this little clause, and from the Son. They said the Spirit proceeds from the Father and from the Son. They tacked this little thing on. This, in their words, ensured that the Trinity idea was upheld. Well, whenever one of these differences emerged over the course of the years after the Council of Nicaea, one side or the other would constantly bring up this "and from the Son" issue that, well, okay, we lost the Bulgars, but you guys are heretics because you didn't add "and from the Son" to your church. Well, this was a constant growing antagonism here, a theological dispute, and it came to a head in the late 11th century. And at that time, the Vikings, Northmen, whatever you want to call them, looking for nice lands to settle down, decided to settle down in southern Italy. And traditionally, southern Italy was still under the protection of Byzantium. And all the churches in southern Italy were under the patronage of Byzantium. Well, when the Vikings decided to settle there, they conquered this area, And they took all these churches and they removed them from the patronage of Byzantium, and they gave them to the Pope and said, here's our gift to you. You can now have all these churches. The Byzantine emperor said, no, those are our churches. And they began to argue back and forth. So in 1054, the Pope sent his representative. He sent his cardinal to Byzantium to iron out the issue. And when they met, the cardinal and the patriarch, the head of the church, the formal head of the church in Constantinople, they excommunicated each other. The cardinal said, bye-bye, patriarch, you're out. And the patriarch said, bye-bye, cardinal, you're out. And they excommunicated each other. That was the formal split. It was brought about by this issue of the churches. When the issue of the churches arose, the Byzantines threw in this heretics issue that you guys had added this, and from the Son Clause to the Creed, you can't do that, that's heresy. And so when these two representatives met, they excommunicated each other. The churches split. West went one way, East went the other way. That was a split. The real split occurred in 1204, when crusaders who were supposedly on their way to Egypt were bribed by Venetians to sack Constantinople, to destroy it as a commercial rivalry in the Mediterranean. After that, there was really no further dialogue between the Eastern and Western churches until rather recently. This was crucial because the East was cut off from the West. The East no longer took part in Western cultural developments. And when things happened in the West, like the growth of universities, the Gothic revival, and eventually the Renaissance, the East missed all that because it had been, isolated. With regards to Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire, it was crucial in two different ways, two different respects. With regards to the West, after 1200 is when the Byzantine Empire was important to the West, because at that time the universities had been established, scholasticism was growing, the West was renewing its interest in the ancients, and as the West began to rediscover its classical past, it turned to Byzantium. And it went to Byzantium, and it got access to a lot of authors and everything that had long been forgotten. So after 1200, Byzantium played this crucial role in helping push forward the West's cultural reawakening. For Eastern Europe, far more important, because for Eastern Europe, that is where it got its political, cultural, religious, economic legacies. All its ideas, the way the states were formed, the way the states were run, and its religion were all borrowed directly from Byzantium. And as such, they developed in a completely different way than Western Europe because they continued the traditions of Byzantium. And there is that, it's not an Iron Curtain anymore, but there is that dividing line between East and West, which dates back to the Byzantine Emperor. In a way, you can even say the division of the Roman Emperor, the Roman Empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries was the heralding of the division of Europe into Eastern and Western halves because they split and went eventually different ways.